Bombs, bodies, explosions, beer. Hi everyone, the video you're watching right now is the first in a series I'm going to be putting out examining interesting articles of self-publishing, also known as books. And I use that generic adjective interesting because while it's undoubtedly true that a lot of stuff that gets self-published is just awful dreck, and occasionally it is so awful in a way that is just too amusing to ignore, and there's going to be a lot of mockery of bad books in this series, but roasting bad books is not 100% the entirety of what I want to do with this series. So I'm going to start off with a book that actually has a lot of pleasures buried within it. The book we're going to be looking at is called Lark Farm in Flanders Fields by Peter Johnson and published by Syntelix Publishing. The story is about a man, Nigel Hendrick, who's a Scotland Yard detective who happens to be on a bicycle tour of the Belgian battlefields of the First World War. Now, Nigel is apparently meant to be a recurring character from a series where he solves crimes and does detective stuff. And arguably, he does solve a crime in this book too. But probably the most eccentric thing about the story is that he barely does that. For almost the entirety of this very, very short book, about 170 pages, the script for this video might be longer, Nigel, the vacation detective, literally just acts like a tourist. It almost feels like the literary equivalent of when businessmen set up their conferences in Hawaii or something, just so they have an excuse to go to Hawaii on company expense. Reading this book, I got the strong feeling that, one, the real-life author had recently been on a bike tour of the battlefields of World War I in Flanders. Two, he found it so terribly interesting he wanted to write a fictionalized account of it. Three, because he thinks all stories should be about detectives solving crimes or something to get people's attention. Four, therefore, we better stick crime on the end of this book that clearly really is meant to be a kind of a travel diary. And I mean it when I say that he barely solves a crime, the crime that supposedly forms a plot of this book. The story opens in classic Dan Brownian fashion with a suspicious explosion of a shell long buried in the Flemish soil, which kills several characters. And then there's about 150 pages of our boy Nigel visiting graveyards and monuments, blissfully unaware of anything out of place. Well, there are a few hints for the reader to grab onto. The main character, who's a professional detective, nobly fails to notice anything is amiss until the Belgian police make him aware of this. Then after, covering miles and miles of flat Flemish countryside on his bicycle, powered largely by local Belgian ale, it's wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. The detective has uncovered an illegal organ harvesting ring run by a Serbian terrorist organization targeting the family who lives on a small Flemish farmhouse because of a weird vengeance scheme having to do with the NATO intervention in the 90s. Honestly, it's pretty kooky and an interesting yarn, but literally all of the details are spelled out by the villain over a few pages after she has been subdued and is literally just stalling for time, waiting for an explosion to go off, and there's been no hint at all as to any of this. And so literally just a monologue at the end explaining everything that is supposed to have been going on to the surface the whole time that could fill a whole nother spy novel that I probably would not read. But that's okay, because while it's funny that Peter Johnson felt the need to tack on a totally random crime plot that you have to really stretch before you see any connection to any of the other themes of this book, it's probably for the best that it doesn't interrupt the story more, because the slightly fictionalized travelogue is really what you're going to get out of the book if you read it. Like, despite that, Johnson, who is a retired medical professional, totally looks like the kind of retired white guy who self-publishes his own shitty crime novels as a hobby. His writing is not bad. He has a natural lilt to his sentences, and he can produce winners like... That's not bad writing, you know. Moreover, he gives real thought to the subject matter of the book. A lot of the story is just Nigel taking his new special bike, his relationship with which is also kind of adorable, to different sites of World War I carnage and trying to imagine what it would be like to live, fight, and die there as a young man. The Flemish countryside is well defined as a real place with real distinguishing characteristics to be explored, and that makes the book that In Flanders Fields could most favorably compared to, for me, be Three Men in a Boat, which you should read if you want some lighthearted but sometimes philosophical escapades on a simple and pleasant tour of rural Europe. You also learn a lot about the war, and a lot of what Flanders is like now is a place where so much fighting happened, with dead bodies and unburst bombs showing up all the time from the soil. If you disturb it at all, you really get the feeling that the author learned a lot on his own little trip and just wanted to share it in a kind of warped travel diary. One of the longest and most unusual sections in the book is a really fine-toothed description of two Belgian chefs cooking a delicious and, I assume, authentic meal for the main character and his friend in exhaustive detail. I mean, literally describing every step of the cooking process. And it's boring and weird and colorful and self-indulgent, and it very much feels to fit the point of the book, even though it doesn't have much of a point in a detective novel. Of course, there are some goofy hiccups. Of course, there are some goofy hiccups. Johnson provides his own illustrations, which range from the primitive yet evocative of a middle-aged dude separated from his wife, pondering carnage and tragedy, while also acting like the biggest flippin' tourist in the world, that is. While sometimes evocative of something a bit saggy, I don't know. Then there's the worst scene in the whole book, where Nigel runs into a young Australian man in a war cemetery who claims that he works there. He points to a name on the memorial and says, "That name is my name," like it's the remains of his great-grandfather or something, who he's named after. Then kind of wanders off. And later, Nigel runs into another employee of the cemetery who's like, "You ran into who? Nobody by that name working here." And it's just meant to be the ghost of this old veteran who's met the main character, and it's just the moment when I rolled my eyes the hardest reading this book. Then there's the dialogue. This is the major downside of an author who really wants to inform readers about the ins and outs of World War I and its legacy in Flanders, because everybody, by which I mean all the characters, everybody talks like a guidebook, without exception, just opening up and laying these big descriptive eggs with their mouths on the heads of the reader, and hatches into something that no real human would ever say. It is customary in Belgium for us to try to do much and say little. It may be that we have been overrun so often in history that we have learned to keep our heads down, or it may be a little bit of humility, having seen so many men from all parts of the world lay down their lives for us. Having grown up nearby, I never felt that my voice would ever be heard outside of my own small circle of family and friends. I was content for this to be so, but when we opened our B&B, persons from all over the world came to witness this place, where so many men came from afar and were lost. I mean, there is no real dialogue in this book. Even in a flashback scene to Nigel's youth, where he discusses a bizarre fling with a French girl on vacation in an anecdote that is so tangential, yet oddly engrossing, that it actually cannot be called anything other than literary. This is how she talks. Monsieur Brevard was but a little boy who became distraught when Saint-Exupéry was lost without a trace while flying a warplane over the Mediterranean Sea in 1944. Then she paused and said, "Now let me show you the unique way that Monsieur Brevard has memorialized Saint-Exupéry. Look, for example, at the labels of the wine bottles." Oh my God, we're reading a self-published book. Get us out of here. However, there are little moments where Johnson overcomes his amateurism and gives us something kind of good. It could be right after that awful cemetery scene where the main character thinks about the winds that affect his cycling route in comparison with the same winds that carried poison gas 100 years before, which is just so much better than what he was going for with the ghost. Or the great magical realism moment where his bike light flickers in direction of the crime scene, which he is otherwise totally unaware of. Like, actually, it really feels like the bicycle solves the crime for him in this book, which really adds more strongly to the case and the feeling that the crime element of this story is a little bit parenthetical. There are also lots of birds which follow Nigel around as he bikes and are softly implied to be the ghosts of World War I dead. And oh my God, that is just so much better than when he actually meets an Australian ghost. So ultimately, I enjoyed taking this little cycle tour through World War One tourism, and I hope that it can survive the tumorous growth of a detective novel that is trying to suffocate it.